The Artemis II astronauts traveled around the moon and sent back some jaw-dropping pictures. Blue Origin pops a new Glen tank and destroys the building around it while also planning a new launch pad. And speaking of launch pads, Firefly wants to launch from the sea. As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. Okay, there's no way you missed this. 4 astronauts flew around the moon this week, marking humanity's return to our celestial companion for the first time in over half a century. The 4 Artemis II astronauts went further from home than any humans ever in history. They got to see the moon up close, and they even sent back some mind-blowing pictures before returning home. We'll get to all of that in this episode, and of course we covered the first leg of the journey in last week's episode, but a quick recap never hurts. So let's start from the top. Last week, on April 1st, the SLS rocket lifted off from Launch Complex 39B at the Kennedy Space Center. On top was the Orion capsule, named Integrity, and its crew of 4. NASA astronauts Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Canadian Space Agency's Jeremy Hansen, and of course, their zero-G indicator named Rise. A few minor issues aside, the whole launch campaign was pretty much textbook. The 49-hour and 40-minute countdown was intense, but it appeared to go by smoother than any countdown that we'd ever seen before for any SLS wet dress rehearsal or launch attempt. The launch itself went by without a hitch, and SLS delivered Integrity into its target orbit. A few hours into flight, the capsule separated from the ICPS upper stage, and its crew performed the proximity operations demonstration. During this test, Reid and Victor took control of the spacecraft and manually piloted it around the ICPS to test approaching other spacecraft. Now, up to that point, the mission had gone by really smoothly, but that doesn't mean that there weren't any issues. Particularly, the toilet kept plaguing the crew, who even had to rely on backup facilities for a while. The first time it broke down, Christina Cook, who has lovingly dubbed herself as the Space Plumber, successfully fixed it.
I'll take that one. I'm the Space Plumber. I'm proud to call myself the Space Plumber.
But later in the mission, a vent line between the toilet and the vacuum of space was blocked. Mission Control suspected that some of the stuff that went into the toilet had frozen and clogged the line, so Orion reoriented to bask in the sunlight with the hopes that it would thaw the blockage away. However, a few days later, Artemis II flight director Rick Henfling told the media that NASA no longer believed that the frozen vent theory was causing the waste dump problems. The current hypothesis is that a chemical reaction was occurring with something used to prevent wastewater biofilms, potentially generating debris that was clogging a filter. On their way to the moon, the crew conducted several tests, including one in which they donned their spacesuits and went through a number of procedures simulating an emergency situation. Throughout the journey, the European Service Module was set to perform 3 trajectory correction burns, but it actually performed the TLI so precisely that the first 2 corrections were scrapped. It did end up doing a 19-second burn on flight day 5, shortly after which the capsule entered the lunar sphere of influence, the part of space where the moon's gravity is the dominant gravitational force. Now, of course, Earth's gravity is still tugging on the spacecraft, just like the moon pulls on our planet and causes tides, but within this sphere, the moon wins the gravitational tug-of-war. Then on flight day 6, Integrity and its crew passed the distance record set by Apollo 13, going farther than any human had ever gone before. They didn't have much time to let that sink in though, because shortly thereafter, they had to prepare the capsule for the main event, the lunar flyby. During this time, the astronauts made their closest approach to the moon, which meant doing a lot of work. Now, of course, we've had very detailed images of the moon since the Apollo era, and all of the robotic explorers that came after as well, but some things just don't translate well on camera. So NASA prepared a whole list of science observations for the crew to complete by studying the moon with their own Mark I eyeballs. They documented surface color, brightness, and texture differences, and later discussed what they saw with scientists. Believe it or not, they were actually the very first humans to see some parts of the far side of the moon with the naked eye, as these areas, normally hidden from view due to lighting conditions, happened to be in sunlight. Not only that, there was also even more to see in the dark. The moon is constantly bombarded by meteoroids, and even a small one shows up as a flash of light against the unlit surface. Unbelievably, the astronauts counted 6 of these flashes during their observation period. Besides doing science, they also had the all-important task of sharing the experience with the 8.3 billion humans left behind. So this week, we got some amazing pictures back, including some stunning Earth-set pictures. Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders captured the famous Earthrise picture during his flight, and the Artemis II crew got the opportunity for a redo on their flight as they saw our home planet set behind and rise above the moon from their perspective. After Orion emerged from the 40-minute pass behind the moon, during which communications with Earth were impossible, the astronauts had another unique opportunity. And this one only happened because they launched during the April 1st window. Their path through space meant that they got to see a solar eclipse. With the sun blocked from view, the astronauts got to see a pretty phenomenal sight. Some of the moon's features were even still visible as they were lit by Earthshine, light bouncing off our planet, illuminating the lunar surface. In the background, planets were even visible: Saturn, Mars, Mercury, and on the other side, Venus. Meanwhile, the moon was gloriously backlit by the glow of the zodiacal light, reflecting off dust particles in the inner solar system, with a bit of the solar corona visible too. During one of their calls back home, the crew also took the opportunity to suggest names for 2 craters on the moon that had not previously been named. They were able to spot both with the naked eye and their camera lenses. For one, they proposed the name Integrity after their capsule. For the other, they proposed the name Carol after Reed Wiseman's late wife, who passed away from cancer in 2020. What followed was an emotional moment for the crew, and for many of us here on the ground too.
And we would like to call it Carol, and you spell that Carroll.
The trip around the moon continued, and on flight day 7, Integrity left the lunar sphere of influence, and later that day, the crew performed a direct communications test with the ISS. Now, of course, there was no ISS during the Apollo days, so they took the opportunity to test communication between the 2 crewed spacecraft. Day 8 saw a few small changes to the plan. The crew was supposed to test setting up a radiation shelter inside of Orion, but that was scrapped to give a bit more time to ready the capsule for its re-entry back into the Earth's atmosphere. They were also supposed to perform another manual piloting test, but this one was skipped to allow for some testing related to a small problem with the service module. An oxidizer manifold in the propulsion system had seen an unexpected increase in pressure earlier in the flight, so ground teams had developed some tests to get a better understanding of what was going on. Scrapped piloting test aside, Integrity and its crew were well on their way back. Some correction burns were made along the way, and then on flight day 10, the capsule and its crew got ready to return home. After supporting Integrity on its roughly 500,000-mile journey to the moon and back, the European service module's work was complete. Around 20 minutes before reaching the entry interface, the point where Earth's atmosphere begins to take hold, the Orion capsule used its 12 thrusters to separate from the service module as it prepared for re-entry. This was the opportunity for one final raise burn to fine-tune the flight path angle and perform a couple of roll maneuvers. These put additional distance between Integrity and the service module, which drifted away to make its own destructive re-entry into the atmosphere. Then it was time for the crew to go visors down for the 13-minute ride down. Orion entered our atmosphere southeast of Hawaii at about 122 kilometers above Earth's surface, traveling at a maximum speed of 10.7 kilometers per second. That's just under 24,000 miles per hour and over Mach 31. This was one of the fastest crewed re-entries attempted, faster than the Mach 25 of the space shuttle re-entries, but not quite breaking the Apollo 10 record, which was between Mach 32 and 33. Orion used what's called a lofted or skip entry profile, briefly dipping into the upper atmosphere before lifting back out again. That skip helps to bleed off speed, spread the heat load, and fine-tune the landing point roughly 2,000 miles downrange. After Artemis I revealed unexpected erosion on Orion's heat shield, engineers adjusted the way that the spacecraft re-enters our atmosphere. The shorter skip profile for this mission is designed to reduce stress on the heat shield, instead having it come in at a steeper angle than Artemis I. As plasma built up around the vehicle, Integrity entered an expected 6-minute communications blackout, with mission control unable to receive telemetry. During that time, temperatures on the heat shield peaked at around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about half as hot as the surface of the sun. Inside of the capsule, the crew felt forces building to around 3.9 Gs, roughly 4 times their own body weight on Earth, as Orion decelerated in the upper atmosphere.
Houston, Integrity, we have you loud and clear.
When Integrity emerged out of the communications blackout period, it was still traveling at supersonic speeds as it closed in on its targeted landing site in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. At least 7 NASA assets were in the air, providing us with views as the capsule made its final descent. Then the capsule released its forward bay cover, which protects the capsule's parachutes, followed by the 2 drogue parachutes, which slowed the capsule's descent to around 200 miles per hour. Then, 3 pilot chutes deployed the 3 main orange parachutes, which slowed Integrity to less than 20 miles per hour before it safely touched down about 9 days and 90 minutes after liftoff.
Houston, Integrity, splashdown, sending post-landing command now.
Awaiting the capsule, around 5 miles away at the Waypoint Alpha staging area, was the USS John P. Murtha, an amphibious transport dock ship named in honor of the late Pennsylvania congressman. The ship has a floodable internal dock, a helicopter pad, and onboard medical facilities, and rehearsed the recovery of a test capsule back in January. Once the landing director gave the clear, divers approached Orion and conducted assessments to ensure that it was safe before helping the crew to exit the capsule. The team attached an inflatable stabilization collar around the base to keep the capsule stable and upright, followed by the large inflatable raft known as the front porch, which acts as a stable floating deck for the crew to step onto. The capsule was powered down around 15 minutes after splashdown, after which the hatch was opened for the crew to egress. The crew had practiced this at both the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory in Houston and in these same waters as far back as 2023. Christina Cook, who was nearest to the hatch, exited first, followed by Victor Glover, Jeremy Hansen, and finally the commander, Reed Wiseman. With all 4 astronauts safely on the front porch, the capsule was towed away while the crew waited to be lifted by 2 Navy helicopters, each taking 2 crew back to the recovery vessel. The crew then went to the ship's medical bay for routine post-flight checkups. They'll next be flown to shore over the next 12 to 24 hours, where they'll set foot on solid ground for the first time in 10 days. Integrity was towed into the well deck of the ship, following the same procedures that we saw for the recovery of Artemis I. With it safely on board, the recovery ship will return to Naval Base San Diego, where it will undergo some initial inspections and offload some of the more critical items, such as data cards, before being returned to Florida by truck. We certainly can't wait to see the wealth of additional photographs taken by the crew in the coming days, and are excited to finally say, welcome home. Alright, you'd think we'd be done talking about lunar news for now, but it turns out NASA isn't the only one thinking about the moon. So get ready for some quick-fire stories from around the world, starting with Russia, which has pushed back parts of its lunar exploration program for 3 future missions, Luna 28 through 30, which are now delayed into the mid-2030s. This is a significant shift that moves some of its long-term moon ambitions nearly a decade later than previously planned. The Luna 26 and 27 missions, which focus on tech validation and site scouting, are still targeting this decade. The Luna 28 mission, which aims to collect and return soil samples from the lunar South Pole region, is now delayed to at least 2032. The program continues to feel the impact of the failed Luna 25 mission, Russia's first lunar mission in decades, which crashed in 2023. Astrobotic is currently targeting no earlier than July for the launch of its Griffin 1 mission, which will also carry a small rover experiment called Beacon. Beacon is a small rover using the company's Cube rover hardware, which will navigate using Mission Control's Spacefarer software. The mission will gather data for rovers exploring shadowed regions of the moon, testing AI-driven navigation and operations directly on the lunar surface. In addition to hitching the rover to Griffin 1, Astrobotic has integrated LandCam X, a Belgian-designed landing camera that will image the moon during descent, leading to smarter and safer landings. Meanwhile, Blue Origin has also been busy testing its Blue Moon Mark 1 lunar lander. The lander, named Endurance, entered the vacuum chamber at NASA's Johnson Space Center in mid-February for thermal vacuum, or TVAC, testing to mimic the conditions that it'll experience in space. This week, Blue announced that Endurance successfully made it through the test campaign and had left the thermal vacuum chamber. Interestingly, the test campaign was supposed to last approximately 11 days, but the lander clearly has stayed for much longer. We don't know whether that's because the teams needed time to prepare or whether something held them up. Either way, Blue declared it was a success, and it is now preparing Endurance to head back to Florida. Blue's planning to launch it later this year, so if you want to stay in the loop with that story, you know what to do. There's a subscribe button somewhere and a like button too. Meanwhile, the company has also been developing technology to turn moon regolith into breathable oxygen. That's right, they're turning moon dust into fresh air. The Air Pioneer technology, developed in Blue's Space Resources Center of Excellence in Los Angeles, melts simulated regolith at high temperatures in a reactor, then passes a current through it, prompting it to release oxygen and other gases through electrolysis. Once purified using the hardware on the right of this image, these gases then emerge as medical and propellant-grade oxygen. Pretty neat, huh? Lunar regolith is rich in oxygen, around 45% by mass, but it needs to be chemically extracted. Once scaled, this technology could produce oxidizer for rockets, as well as breathable oxygen for astronauts as we progress towards a lunar base. Finally, China still intends to put boots on the moon by the end of the decade, and the rocket that will get them there is the Changzheng 10. This 3-core heavy-lift rocket measures 5 meters in diameter and is still in development. We'll see 2 single-core variants launch later this year before it makes its planned debut in 2027. A first-stage booster for the rocket already flew in February of this year, supporting the recent Mengzhou in-flight abort test, completing the mission with a controlled vertical landing in the sea. Hardware for the Changzheng 10B cargo variant has been seen being transported and erected vertically at the Hainan Commercial Launch Complex 2 in Wenchang, where it's rumored that it could take its maiden launch before the end of the month. If you want to dive deeper into China's lunar ambitions and whether we really are in a new space race with them, then we've made an in-depth video just for you. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with some politics, as the White House released its budget request for 2027, which includes NASA's budget. And it's pretty much a repeat of last year, with the agency receiving a proposed 23% budget cut. Now, of course, most of last year's changes were stopped by Congress, but more about that in a bit. So what's proposed to be cut? Well, in a nutshell, pretty much everything that doesn't have to do with the moon. Just like last year, science was dealt the biggest blow, with $3.4 billion being removed from the agency's science budget, cutting 40 missions. Meanwhile, space operations, which mostly covers the International Space Station, was proposed to be cut by $1.1 billion. Also, just like last year, the Office of STEM Engagement was proposed to be cut entirely, which seems at odds, at least in the long term, with Administrator Jared Isaacman's desire to foster and build competencies within the NASA organization. You really can't build up a workforce without getting the next generation on board. On the flip side, the Artemis program was proposed to get an additional $731 million to land astronauts on the moon by 2028, and NASA's setting aside $175 million to get started on a lunar base camp. The Commercial LEO Development Program, which is set to incubate a commercial successor to the ISS, also received a slight increase. So how bad is this really? Isaacman pointed out that NASA will have to focus on efficiency and outcomes so the taxpayers get more value for their money. That's not bad, and is certainly in line with the announcements made during the recent Ignition event. But on the other hand, cutting dozens of missions doesn't really seem to help the agency's output at all. But of course, we need to address the elephant on Capitol Hill. The White House may have requested the lowest budget since 1961, but last year, Congress wasn't having any of it. NASA's budget was all but restored by the reconciliation bill known as the Big Beautiful Bill, as well as a set of amendments made to the budget before it passed. The same might happen again, so maybe NASA will get to do a whole lot more with all of that newly gained efficiency. New public filings by the Federal Aviation Administration have confirmed plans for a second launch site for New Glenn at Cape Canaveral, even though Blue Origin has yet to officially announce it. The entries submitted into the Obstruction Evaluation Database on April 8th describe plans to construct a 500-foot umbilical launch tower along with a 600-foot lightning protection tower at a site labeled Slick 36B/11 just north of Blue Origin's existing launch complex. That naming is key and strongly suggests an expansion beyond Launch Complex 36 into the neighboring Launch Complex 11, pointing to what could become a second New Glenn pad at the Cape. New Glenn is explicitly cited in the filing, though Blue Origin hasn't formally announced the project. A second launch pad would certainly give the company greater flexibility and higher launch cadence as it looks ahead to missions for Amazon's Kuiper constellation and its own Blue Moon Pathfinder mission later this year. In the meantime, the flight-proven booster Never Tell Me the Odds is being prepared for its second flight as New Glenn takes to the skies for the third time no earlier than April 16th. This mission will carry the second of AST SpaceMobile's next-generation Bluebird Block 2 communication satellites into low Earth orbit, and will mark the first time that New Glenn flies with a reused first stage. Blue's also busy with hardware for missions further down the line, and it appears that one of the stages might have caused some trouble. Blue was testing an upper stage in the 2CAT, or second stage cleaning and testing facility. Something clearly went wrong during the test, as it blew a hole in the roof and damaged other parts of the building as well. It's still a developing story as of recording, so we don't know exactly what went down, but this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. In August of 2024, the building's door was blown off during a failed test, and it took them ages to repair it. Though damaged, the new door is still in place, so they might have opened it ahead of the test. Whatever happened, it's not great news for Blue. Hopefully, it won't set them back too far, as they are trying to increase cadence with New Glenn. But we'll keep you posted in a future video. Also, in the first stage department, CEO Dave Limp has shared the name of their third New Glenn booster, which is most likely slated to fly on the vehicle's fourth flight. Please welcome, No, It's Necessary. Firefly and Seagate Space announced a Memorandum of Understanding on April 6th to explore offshore launch capability for Firefly's Alpha rocket. The proposal would utilize Seagate's modular and semi-submersible Gateway platform as a purpose-built floating spaceport, enabling Alpha to deliver rapidly deployable launches from ocean locations. That mobility could open up a wider range of orbital inclinations that aren't always accessible from fixed launch sites, supporting everything from commercial missions to national security and hypersonic test flights. Alpha has flown 7 times to date from Space Launch Complex 2 at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Firefly is also working towards additional launch sites, including Wallops Island in Virginia later this year and Esrange in Sweden from 2027. The offshore concept is still in the engineering study phase. Seagate received approval in principle for its Gateway platform from the American Bureau of Shipping in December, the first of its kind under new guidelines specifically developed for offshore spaceports. Alpha's next flight in the coming months will debut the longer and upgraded Block 2 configuration, though there's no timeline yet for a first offshore mission, so we'll have to wait and see. As we welcome the Artemis II crew home, Firefly is also making progress towards its second lunar mission. The company has been conducting separation tests for its next Blue Ghost lander mission, currently targeting no earlier than December. These tests focused on the system that will release the dual payload adapter from Firefly's Elytra transfer vehicle, deploying the European Space Agency's Lunar Pathfinder satellite into lunar orbit. The mission will carry 6 payloads in total, including 3 delivered through NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program. The European Space Agency is studying lasers for in-space propulsion. An international group of researchers blasted chunks of graphene aerogel with lasers during a parabolic flight last year. Aerogels are a type of material made up of a sparse web of solid structure, resulting in a strong but ultralight material. It's ideal for when you want to make something on a strict mass budget, like a spacecraft. Although the stuff couldn't be moved by the laser under Earth's gravity, the chunks of material shot up violently in just 30 milliseconds in microgravity conditions during that parabolic flight. Applications of this technology are still in the realm of science fiction at this point, but one day it could be used to build lightweight satellites or even solar sails, which use nothing but the minute push of sunlight to propel a spacecraft up to a high velocity. This concept has been demonstrated successfully in space already, but it has yet to be applied beyond demonstration missions. Studies like ESA's may eventually help to bring these concepts into reality. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. Aside from the week's main event, Artemis II, this week was packed with launches for internet megaconstellations, starting on April 4th when an Atlas V lifted off from Cape Canaveral. Encapsulated in the rocket's 5-meter fairing were 29 satellites for Amazon's Leo constellation. Also adding satellites to its internet constellation, SpaceX launched 2 Starlink missions, both from California's Vandenberg Space Force Base. Over in China, a Changzheng 8 lifted off from the commercial side of Wenchang to launch 18 satellites for the Space Sail constellation, also known as Qianfan. Meanwhile, a Changzheng 6A took to the skies above Taiwan to launch 5 satellites for another of China's Starlink competitors, the SatNet or Guowang constellation. However, it wasn't just internet satellites this week. We also got a surprise launch from Vandenberg as a Minotaur rocket launched a few satellites for the US military. The converted Peacemaker missile carried the STP-SAT-7 into low Earth orbit, which hosted a handful of research payloads and technology demonstrations. The satellite was accompanied on its way up by 5 CubeSats sharing the ride. Finally, Falcon 9 lifted off from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida on Saturday, carrying a Cygnus cargo resupply craft. The spacecraft is set to arrive at the International Space Station on April 12th, delivering 5 metric tons of supplies, science payloads, and replacement hardware to the orbital outpost. This is the second flight of the extended Cygnus XL variant, which is set to stay at the station for about half a year. The booster that launched the Cygnus came back to Slick 40 for a return to launch site landing at SpaceX's newest landing pad. Looking ahead towards next week, SpaceX is planning 2 Starlink missions, one from either coast. Down the Floridian coast at Launch Complex 36, Blue Origin is also getting ready to fly its 3rd New Glenn mission and the first to reuse a booster. The rocket will launch a communications satellite for AST Space Mobile. We may also see China launch a Kinetica 1, also known as Lijian 1, from Zhotuan, and it seems that Russia is finally planning to launch its inaugural Soyuz 5 from Baikonur. The details of these flights are still up in the air, or actually down on the ground, I guess, so keep an eye on our next Spaceflight app and website for the latest details. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.